They had exactly 6 hours to clear out of the only house that had ever felt like family before the locks were changed for good, betrayed by their own blood and left with nothing but a duffel bag and a set of rusted keys. Two sisters drove 3 hours into the Georgia pine woods to their late grandfather's forgotten cabin. But hidden beneath his workshop floor was a truth that would tear their family apart a second time and put it back together in a way neither of them ever expected. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, and Maren Ashby still remembers the exact words her uncle used. "The house isn't yours. It was never going to be yours." Maren was 27, and her younger sister Wren was 24. Their mother had died when Wren was still in middle school, and their father, a quiet, gentle man named Foster Ashby, had raised them alone in a modest brick house outside Macon, Georgia, working double shifts at a freight yard to keep the lights on and the girls fed. Foster wasn't a man of many words, but he showed up. Every recital, every report card, every scraped knee, he was there, steady as the seasons. When he passed suddenly of a stroke 8 months ago, collapsing in the kitchen on an ordinary Thursday morning, the girls assumed the house, paid off years earlier through decades of overtime shifts, would simply stay theirs. There had never been a will. There had never needed to be one, or so they thought. Their Uncle Dale, Foster's older brother, thought differently. Dale had spent the better part of 2 decades resenting his younger brother's quiet, steady life, the kind of slow-burning resentment that curdles in silence and waits patiently for an opening. Growing up, Dale had always been the one people expected great things from, the older brother with the bigger laugh, the faster car, the plans that always sounded like they were one signature away from paying off. Foster had been the quiet one, the reliable one, the one nobody bragged about at family reunions. But somewhere in the years between their father's funeral and their mother's, the roles had quietly reversed. Dale had cycled through 3 failed businesses, 2 divorces, and a mounting pile of debt that his charm could no longer outrun, while Foster kept clocking into the freight yard, kept raising his daughters, kept being, in Dale's eyes, infuriatingly fine. When Foster died interstate, Georgia's inheritance code kicked in behind the scenes, and Dale, technically still listed as next of kin alongside the girls under an old joint deed drawn up by their grandparents decades earlier, saw an opportunity he wasn't about to let slip past him. He hired a lawyer. He filed papers. He waited until the girls were still raw with grief, still learning how to function in a house that echoed with their father's absence. And then he struck. On a grey Tuesday morning, 2 sheriff's deputies knocked on the door Maren and Wren had grown up behind and explained, not unkindly, that a court order gave them 6 hours to remove their personal belongings. The girls stood in the doorway in stunned silence, watching one deputy hold out a folded document while the other, visibly uncomfortable with the whole affair, simply looked at his shoes. "There has to be a mistake," Wren said, her voice cracking. "This is our house. We grew up here." "I'm sorry, Ma'am," the older deputy said. "The paperwork's in order. You've got until 6 o'clock. They moved like people in shock, grabbing what they could carry, photo albums, their father's old flannel jacket, a shoebox of documents. Wren had the presence of mind to sweep off the hallway shelf, furniture, dishes, the couch where they'd watched 1,000 ordinary evenings unfold. All of it stayed behind, locked away in a house that no longer belonged to them. "Where are we supposed to go, Wren?" Maren asked later that night, sitting in her car in a gas station parking lot under a buzzing fluorescent light, watching her sister cry into the collar of their father's old flannel jacket, one of the only things they'd managed to save. Wren didn't answer right away. She just held the jacket tighter, breathing in whatever was left of him in the fabric. They had $3,100 spread across 2 checking accounts, a car with 140,000 miles on it, and nowhere to be. Rent in Macon for even a modest 1-bedroom would have swallowed most of what they had left in a single month, first and last month plus deposit. It was Wren, scrolling numbly through her phone at 2 in the morning in a cheap roadside motel, who remembered the cabin. Their grandfather, Otis Ashby, had owned a small hunting cabin deep in the pine flats outside Fitzgerald, Georgia, a place the family hadn't set foot in since his funeral 11 years earlier. Otis had been a cabinet maker by trade, a quiet, exacting man who spent his weekends in that cabin's attached workshop, long after most men his age had put their tools away for good. Nobody had ever bothered to sell the place after he died. Nobody had ever bothered to visit it either. It sat out there in the pines, forgotten, gathering dust and vines and years. "It's still in his name," Wren said, sitting up straight in the dark motel room. "Dale doesn't even know it exists. Dad never talked about it, not once." "You think it's still standing?" Maren asked. "I think it's the only place in this world that's actually still ours," Wren said. They drove out the next morning, following a GPS route that gave up 20 minutes before they arrived. The 2-lane county road narrowing into hard-packed dirt beneath a canopy of longleaf pine, so thick it blotted out the mid-morning sun. The cabin, when they finally found it, looked smaller and sadder than either of them remembered from the handful of childhood visits they could recall. The tin roof had rusted to a deep orange-brown, streaked with dark trails where years of rain had run unchecked. Vines had climbed halfway up the west wall, threading through gaps in the siding, like they were slowly trying to pull the whole structure back into the earth. A family of raccoons had clearly claimed the porch as their own, scattering at the sound of the car doors. Inside wasn't much better. Mouse droppings covered the kitchen counters. The mattress in the single bedroom had collapsed into a nest of stuffing and mildew that neither sister wanted to touch. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, undisturbed for over a decade. But the walls were solid, the roof mostly held, and for the first time in 3 days, nobody was going to make them leave before nightfall. If you're finding this story as gripping as we did putting it together, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because what these two sisters found underneath that workshop floor is about to change everything they thought they knew about their own family. They spent the first week simply making the place livable, hauling out ruined furniture, scrubbing floors on their hands and knees, patching a leak over the kitchen with a blue tarp and a prayer. Grief and fury make excellent fuel for physical labor, and both sisters worked from sunrise until their hands blistered and cracked, until sleep came easier than it had in months, too exhausted for the mind to keep circling the same wound. On one of their supply runs into Fitzgerald that first week, they stopped at a small hardware store on the edge of town to buy caulk and roofing tar. The man behind the counter, an older gentleman named Curtis, who'd run the place for 30 years, squinted at Maren's last name on her debit card and asked if she was any relation to Otis Ashby out on the old Bellinger Road property. "He was my grandfather," Maren said. Curtis's expression shifted, something careful crossing behind his eyes. "Good man. Kept to himself mostly, but a good man. Used to come in here every few months for supplies, always paid cash. Always counted it out slow, like he was thinking hard about something the whole time he did it." He paused, ringing up the tar. "Man like that, careful with his money his whole life, careful with everything, really. You'd be surprised what men like that leave behind when nobody's looking close enough to notice. My own daddy used to say Otis Ashby measured his life the same way he measured lumber, twice before he ever committed to the cut." Maren thanked him and didn't think much of the comment until nearly 2 weeks later, standing in the workshop with a tape measure in her hand. It was during that second week, while Maren was clearing out their grandfather's old workshop attached to the back of the cabin, that she noticed something wrong with the floor. The workshop still held the bones of Otis's life's work, a dust-caked table saw, coils of old wire hung neat on a pegboard, jars of bent nails sorted by size with an almost obsessive precision, each one labeled in his blocky handwriting. Maren had grown up hearing that her grandfather was particular. Standing in that workshop now, running her hand along the dusty pegboard, she understood exactly what people had meant by that. She was measuring the room on her phone to see whether it could double as a second bedroom when the numbers stopped making sense. The workshop's exterior wall, measured corner to corner, ran 14 feet even. The interior, once she accounted for wall thickness, should have come out to roughly 13 feet of usable floor space. Instead, it measured just under 9. "Wren," Maren called out, kneeling by the far wall. Tape measure stretched taut across the floorboards. "Come look at this." Her sister crouched beside her, and together they traced the discrepancy along the workshop's back corner, where a heavy wooden workbench, easily 300 pounds of solid oak, had been bolted directly into the floor. Bolted, not simply resting, immovable, deliberate. "Maybe it's just where the old well casing used to run," Wren offered, though she didn't sound convinced by her own theory. Their grandfather had been eccentric, sure, but he'd also been meticulous, and meticulous men didn't build crooked workshops by accident. Maren pressed her palm against the edge of the workbench and felt it shift, just slightly, under pressure. Not much, but enough to matter. She grabbed a crowbar off the wall rack, its handle worn smooth from decades of her grandfather's grip, and worked the flat end beneath the bench's front leg. After several minutes of grinding, sweat-soaked effort, the entire bench swung outward on a hidden hinge neither sister had noticed, revealing a trap-door set flush into the floorboards beneath it, its edges sealed shut with decades of dust and dried cork. Dad never mentioned a cellar, Wren whispered, stepping back instinctively. Dad might not have known it was here, Maren said, already working her fingers under the trapdoor's edge. The hinges screamed in protest as Maren forced the door open, and a breath of cool, mineral-smelling air rose up from the darkness below, carrying with it the faint scent of cedar. She lowered a flashlight down first, then herself. Boots finding narrow wooden stairs that descended into a space roughly the size of a walk-in closet, lined with cedar planks their grandfather must have installed by hand. The wood still faintly fragrant after more than a decade, sealed away from the world. At the center of the room sat a single steel filing cabinet, the kind with a built-in combination lock, and beside it, an old canvas army duffel bag, zipped shut and remarkably well-preserved in the dry cellar air. Wren climbed down behind her, ducking under the low ceiling, and for a long moment neither sister spoke. The cellar felt less like a hiding place and more like a shrine, deliberate, cared for, waiting patiently for exactly this moment. Maren tried the filing cabinet first, locked, as expected, but the mechanism was old enough that a firm strike from the crowbar's flat end popped the top drawer loose on the second try. Inside were folders, dozens of them, organized with the same obsessive precision their grandfather had brought to his nail jars, each one labeled in careful block letters. Land surveys, old bank statements going back 30 years, receipts from lumber suppliers going back even further, some of them so faded the ink had nearly vanished into the paper. And near the back, a thick manila envelope labeled in their grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. For my granddaughters, if Dale ever tries something. Wren's hands were shaking too badly to open it, so Maren did. Inside was a single typed letter, dated nearly 12 years earlier, just months before Otis Ashby's death. It began without preamble, as though he'd been rehearsing these words for years before finally committing them to paper. If you're reading this, it's because your uncle finally showed his true colors. I always knew he would. I've watched that boy chase easy money his whole life and step over anyone standing between him and it. I want you to know I saw this coming long before either of you were old enough to understand what a family could do to itself, and I made sure he couldn't touch what actually mattered. The letter went on to explain something neither sister had ever known. In the final years of his life, Otis had grown deeply suspicious of Dale's mounting debts and increasingly desperate behavior, the late-night calls asking to borrow money, the vague business schemes that always seemed to collapse right after Dale had spent someone else's investment. There had been one call in particular, the letter said, where Dale had asked Otis outright what would happen to the family property when he was gone, phrased casually, almost offhand. But Otis had heard the real question underneath it, clear as a bell ringing in an empty room. Quietly, without telling a soul, not even Foster, Otis had restructured the bulk of his estate, moving decades of careful cabinetry income and even more careful investing into a private trust that named Foster as sole trustee, with Maren and Wren listed as the named beneficiaries, set to inherit in full the moment they both turned 25. The house in Macon was never the real inheritance, the letter read. It was the decoy. I let Dale believe your father got the good end of the deal, so he'd leave the real thing alone and go bother somebody else. Everything that actually matters is in the duffel bag beside this letter, and the account numbers are on the second page. Foster knows where to look, or he will once I tell him. If something happened to me before I could explain it properly, and he's gone before he could pass it on to you, then I am sorry, truly, and I hope you found this the exact way I planned for you to find it. Slowly. On your own terms. When you needed it most, and not a day before. Wren unzipped the duffel bag with trembling fingers. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect against the damp cellar air, were bundles of savings bonds dating back decades, a small stack of gold coins that caught the flashlight beam and threw it back in dull, gleaming flashes, and a sealed bank envelope containing routing information for a trust account neither sister had ever heard mentioned in their entire lives, An account that, according to the enclosed statement stub, had been quietly compounding untouched. For well over a decade, he knew, Maren said, sitting back hard against the cool cedar wall, the letter trembling in her hands. He knew Dale would try something like this someday. He planned for it years before we were even old enough to understand what an inheritance was, before we even understood what losing Dad would feel like. The second page of documents held the trust's full details. A modest brokerage account that had grown from patient, disciplined contributions into just over $340,000, along with the deed to a second, smaller property Otis had purchased and folded quietly into the trust 2 decades earlier. A rental duplex outside Savannah that had been generating steady income the entire time, income that, per the trust's own terms, had been automatically reinvested every single month because no one had ever come forward to claim it. Their father had never told them any of this. Whether Foster had simply been waiting for the right moment to explain, some birthday or graduation he imagined he'd have years to reach, or whether the stroke had taken him before he found the courage to sit his daughters down and lay it all out, they would never know for certain. But sitting in that cellar, surrounded by the quiet, obsessive care of a grandfather who had spent his final years protecting them from a threat they hadn't even known existed, both sisters understood something had shifted permanently, something that could not be undone. We'd love to know what you think so far. Drop a comment if you've ever uncovered something in an old family property that changed the way you saw a relative, and keep watching, because the confrontation that's coming is one of the most satisfying parts of this whole story. They did not go back to Macon that week. They needed a lawyer who understood trust law well enough to make absolutely certain Dale could never touch what their grandfather had built. And more than that, they needed time to simply sit with the weight of what they'd found. For 3 days, they barely left the cellar, cross-referencing bank statements under flashlight beam, tracing the paper trail of a decade of quiet, disciplined compounding, piecing together the shape of a plan their grandfather had built entirely alone, in secret out of love disguised as caution. The lawyer they eventually found, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renata Cole, who worked out of a converted house in downtown Fitzgerald, confirmed everything within a week of reviewing the documents. The trust was airtight. Drafted years earlier by an estate attorney Otis had driven 2 hours to consult, specifically to avoid exactly the kind of contest Dale was now waging over an entirely different asset. Dale had no claim to it whatsoever, had almost certainly never known it existed, and had spent considerable legal fees fighting tooth and nail for a house that, compared to what their grandfather had actually left behind, amounted to almost nothing at all. He didn't really want the house, Renata explained, sliding the trust documents across her desk with a faint, knowing smile. Not deep down, he wanted to feel like he'd finally won something, after a lifetime of watching your father get the stable job, the stable marriage, the stable life he could never quite hold on to himself. Your grandfather made absolutely sure that whatever he won wouldn't actually matter. Before any of that reached Dale by mail, though, there was one more stop the sisters insisted on making themselves. Renata advised against it, warned them there was no legal reason to give Dale any FaceTime at all, but Maren was firm. She wanted him to hear it from them, not from a stranger's letterhead. They met him at a diner off the highway outside Macon, neutral ground, the kind of place with sticky vinyl booths and a laminated menu that hadn't changed in 20 years. Dale showed up in a pressed shirt he clearly thought made him look like a man who'd already won, sliding into the booth across from them with the easy, practiced confidence of someone used to talking his way out of consequences. "I figured you two would come around eventually," he said, waving down a waitress for coffee before either sister had said a word. "No hard feelings. Business is business. Your dad would have understood that better than anybody." "Don't," Wren said quietly, and something in her voice made Dale's easy smile falter, just slightly. Maren set a single photocopied page on the table between them, the second page of the trust documents, the account numbers still visible along the bottom edge. Dale glanced down at it, and his coffee stopped halfway to his mouth. "What is this?" he said, and it wasn't really a question. "Grandpa Otis left everything that actually mattered in a trust 12 years ago," Maren said, keeping her voice level, the way she imagined her grandfather might have, long before you ever thought to go after the house. "He knew what you were, Dale. He planned around you before we even understood we'd need it. Dale's face moved through several expressions in quick succession: disbelief, calculation, and finally, something that looked almost like shame, though it didn't last long enough to be sure. "That's not possible," he said. "That house was the estate. There wasn't anything else." "There was," Wren said. "You just weren't trusted with it." He didn't say much after that. He sat staring at the page, doing the math on 2 decades of quietly compounded interest. On a rental property he'd never known existed. On a house he'd fought so hard for that now felt even to him like a consolation prize handed to a man who'd never earned the main event. When the sisters stood to leave, he didn't try to stop them, didn't offer an apology, just sat there in the booth with his cooling coffee and the photocopy, looking smaller than either of them remembered him ever looking before. Dale found out the rest 3 weeks later, when Renata's office sent formal legal notice that the trust would be distributing its full value to Maren and Wren Ashby exactly as originally intended. A cousin later told Wren that Dale's own wife, Sarah, said he hadn't spoken a single word for 2 full days after that letter arrived on their kitchen table, that he'd sat out on the back steps of the Macon house, the house he'd fought so hard to take, staring at nothing in particular. Maren and Wren didn't bother fighting him for the Macon house. They let him keep it, empty court victory and all, a hollow prize for a man who had never once, in either of their memories, asked how they were holding up after their father's death. Instead, they used the trust to do exactly what their grandfather seemed to have intended all along. They kept the cabin. It took the better part of a year and a healthy portion of the trust's funds, but by the following spring, the cabin outside Fitzgerald had been transformed. The rotted tin roof was torn off and replaced with standing seam steel built to outlast them both. The workshop was restored down to the studs, their grandfather's original tools cleaned, oiled and rehung, exactly where he'd left them on the pegboard he'd built with his own hands. They kept the old jars of sorted nails exactly as they found them, refusing to so much as reorganize a single one, a small private tribute to a man whose precision had ultimately saved them. The hidden cellar was preserved and structurally reinforced, though they left the trapdoor exactly as they'd found it, a quiet monument to a man who had spent his final years protecting 2 granddaughters he clearly loved more than he ever said out loud. They used a portion of the Savannah duplex's rental income to fund something neither of them had expected to build when this all began, a small scholarship, administered quietly through the county school system, for local kids who had lost a parent young and needed help covering the cost of trade school, welding, plumbing, cabinetry, the kind of steady, careful, honest work that had built their grandfather's quiet fortune in the first place, one measured cut at a time. Curtis from the hardware store became something of a fixture at the cabin over that first year, stopping by every few weeks with supplies he insisted they needed, whether they'd asked for them or not. Sitting on the porch steps some evenings just to talk about the man he'd known for 3 decades and never fully understood, until his granddaughters started filling in the pieces. "He used to say a good plan was one nobody ever noticed you making," Curtis told them one evening, rocking slowly in one of the porch chairs, watching the light fade over the tree line. Guess he meant that a little more literally than any of us realized. On the first anniversary of finding the cellar, Maren and Wren sat together on the newly rebuilt porch, watching the sun drop behind the pines the exact same way it must have 1,000 evenings, while their grandfather worked quietly in the shop below, planning for a threat he would never live to see arrive in person. Wren still kept their father's old flannel jacket folded on the back of a chair inside. Maren still had the original letter, sealed now behind glass in a simple frame mounted above the workshop entrance, where anyone who walked in could read the words their grandfather had left behind for 2 girls he trusted completely to find them exactly when they needed them most. They had been left with 6 hours and a duffel bag full of borrowed clothes. What they found instead, buried beneath a workshop floor in the middle of the pines, was proof that somebody had been quietly watching out for them long after he was gone, planning years ahead of a betrayal he couldn't have known the exact shape of, only the certainty that it would eventually come. The truest inheritance, they came to understand, isn't always the one written plainly into a will for everyone to read. Sometimes it's the one hidden beneath a workshop floor, sealed in cedar and silence, waiting patiently for the right hands to finally pull it into the light. If this story moved you, hit that like button right now and let us know down in the comments. Have you ever found something hidden in a family member's home that changed absolutely everything? Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. And share it with someone who needs a reminder that family isn't always about blood, and sometimes the people who love us best plan for our future long after they're gone.